Hello and welcome. We're here again with author and direct democracy advocate Neil Petrie. Good to see you again, Neil.
And you?
Last time you were here, we spoke about your book, One Vote Away. Can you give us an update on what's happening with the book and what are the next steps for it?
Yeah, it's being put into an audio version now. We've had a volunteer who came forward to help with using an AI system to put it into an audio product. So that is just being looked at now. I've heard the first kind of draft of the preface, so that's going well.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
stuff,
no,
yeah.
I sound very intelligent in it. I was very pleased. Yeah, it was all right. Better than my own voice. But the other thing was, the campaign was to get it out, obviously to the public, and the means to do that was, you don't have a huge marketing budget. You're not, part of some large print house or print run. Then you've got to market it, in some other fashion to get the word out. So I caught Nigel Farage on a smoke break and handed him the book. So it was interesting. Had a nice chat with him again. Gave him the book, explained what we're doing. So he's aware of, the book. Whether he's read it or not is another thing altogether. But I also I saw Andrew Bridgen giving a speech, in which, in fact, he came out without any prompting from me or any of us in the team to back direct democracy as a way to be looking forward and the use of referendums.
Just remind the viewers, he's the MP for...
Northwest Leicestershire or North Leicestershire, it's up that direction. And so he's obviously the one who was banned, really, and the whip was taken away, so he had to leave the Conservatives. But after the speech, I gave him my book as well. So the aim is to strategically, get it into the hands of people who could be important in getting the message out there. Yeah. Because, when you've got a very small budget, then you've got to use it to best effect. As you'll see from the book, which talks about that type of thing.
Yeah.
Because in the end, it's about, getting the book out there so that people are aware of it, but the message may not go out immediately because it's not being, marketed with a huge budget.
Yeah.
But over time, it will get the message out there because it is a manual, as you know. You've read it a couple of times now, I think.
I have, yeah.
You're probably the only person who has read it twice already, apart from me, of course. Yeah. But, so I think, it's going well in terms of getting the message out there.
Yeah.
And, as I say, the plan is obviously to convert people who are already in parties to the idea, and to get the massive number of people backing the idea. And fortunately, that I think will happen fairly rapidly because the idea is simple to explain. You don't have to read the book. Hopefully these talks and all those will help get that message out there. So that's where we're at with the book.
And what's happening with Andrew Bridgen? You're going to meet with him?
Well,
hopefully?
I'd like to, yeah. The plan obviously is to get as many people as possible who are high profile to accept this message. We've been working with Neil Oliver and his people because he's also an advocate for direct democracy, and myself and Richard Borner, who runs Block Vote, which is a voting app that uses these a blockchain technology. So it's a very secure system, unlike the American ones with Dominion and all these other machines. So the aim is to use the blockchain technology, which is how money is transferred, really, covertly and secretly, and without being able to interfere with that transfer. But it'll be the same with the votes, so that it's blockchain enabled, highly secure and publicly verifiable, but anonymous. So your votes are anonymous, but you can see the votes piling up in real time. And you could do a national vote on blockchain and block vote in particular, probably in a matter of hours. So it'd be like the old days when we had paper ones and they used to get it done in a matter of hours,
Yeah.
And then they brought in the voting machines and suddenly it takes days and weeks, to confirm this or that or the other. So, with the blockchain thing, you can watch it live, highly secure but anonymous. So we're advising really on that score to Neil and his team.
Great.
So on the technical side and the deployment of that with other people as well. But the bottom line is, this is the type of technology that could be used in the future if the people wanted it.
That's right.
You know, because they don't have to. You know, but it's a good way of demonstrating direct democracy as well. So it's got two advantages: it's a demonstration tool, and it's a voting app. And in both, instances, it's very useful.
Okay. I mean, you've hit on a little bit there about what your kind of aims are. You know, it's clear from the book exactly what your concerns are. What are your ultimate aims? You know, what is it that you want to achieve from the book?
Right. Well, the book is a manual which makes clear that what I'd like to see and what the movement would like to see, because I'm part of a movement. You know, we've got excellent people on board, working at various levels, working in various directions, but all aiming for the one aim. And the aim is to see that Britain, the people of Britain, control our laws. Now, we don't do that in a representative democracy, which is a misnomer, really. It's a way of, lulling us into the idea that we have a democracy, but in fact we're handing over our votes and our power to these representatives who big themselves up. But in fact, they are whip controlled within the party to follow the party line. So what we're after is very simple in the end. Direct democracy and the tools that it offers, the referendum and the initiative and the recall, but with the referendum in particular, that we can control every law coming out of Parliament if we wish to. So the aim is to have this hybrid form of democracy, similar to that with the Swiss, where the people have the final say if they wish to use that option to stop laws coming out of Parliament or to get them amended. So, and then with the initiative, they can introduce laws as well. But ultimately, we need the people in control, as A.V. Dicey told us in the 1890s. He said, let's get rid of the House of Lords and let's bring in this referendum system, because he'd seen it working by then for about 40 years in Switzerland. And the aim, he said, was to ensure that you can't rely on the parties to look above party. If you want the nation to be governed, then you need to have the referendum on all these important issues. So that's what I'm after. It's a bit late in the day for Dicey, but we can do it. We can do it. And the dissatisfaction that you see with politicians, parties, all of these things, not just in Britain, but all around the world, are tied into this. And it's the failure of representative-only systems. So, you keep your representatives with the Swiss system, but you also have this final layer where the people can decide in the end. So if it goes through and the people are happy with it, it becomes law. So the politicians have done their work and they've created what is a good means to control what we have to do as a nation. Or we have the final say if we don't like it and you get enough support. That's what I'm after, that you have that option.
Okay. You specifically mention how these issues go back a long way, but really started to firm up with this character Cecil Rhodes. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, you've got to think, the time of Cecil Rhodes, 1880s, he starts to make a fortune in South Africa. But it was also at that time that around Europe you'd started to see much more mass democracy. So parties were growing, politicians were becoming more representatives of the people. There weren't so much the old aristocracy. And so by the 1880s, the aristocracy had been pushed aside to some extent, the landed gentry, because in the 1860s, landed gentry still held about 500 of our 600 odd seats. So they were pushed aside more by the rising political, kind of the professional classes, you might call them. So well educated, but not as rich as the old landed gentry. So this happened in the 1880s, and by the time Rhodes had made his fortune, he understood that he could use money to affect things politically, much more so globally, because obviously he was looking at the rail from Cape Town to Cairo, and so he was an imperialist, and he looked more globally, and he was a big fan of the empire. He was the main driver, but he saw that America was the rising power, and he actually preferred the American Constitution to ours. So he wanted this Anglo-American cooperation, rather like the Greek-Roman theme from ancient world, that the Greeks were the brains and the Romans were the strong right arm, and they understood that. And obviously Rhodes and these other imperialists in Britain saw it in a similar fashion. So Rhodes set up the Rhodes Scholarships, many people would have heard of. People like President Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Rhodes Scholarships are the more obvious end of this, but beyond that, he set up groups that would propagate his ideas for a global, within 200 years was his plan, he thought it could be achieved, of this Anglo-American empire taking over the planet and pulling in all of the wealth of the world under their control, because then everything would be peaceful, you see. They've always got these great ideas. Utopian vision. And they think they're being practical about it, of course, but along the way there may be some blood spilled. So,
always.
Yeah, Rhodes was happy to do that. He used mercenaries to take over parts of, Rhodesia. King Lobengula, who was a local chieftain, his people were slaughtered and they took over. So this was the idea that Rhodes had, was for this global empire. And then after World War One, and after Rhodes' death, he had Lord Milner. After 1902, he took over the idea, because Rhodes had left a lot of money to these people, and Lord Milner was the chief administrator in South Africa during the Boer War, and so Milner then carried on the theme, and by World War One, they'd set up these International Institute of Foreign Affairs, basically, which then, with the Americans, took up the idea, because they all met at the armistice talks in 1919 in Paris. And the idea was fed to the Americans, and by 1922, I think it was, you had this, maybe 21, the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations is the most powerful lobby group on the planet, really, for this idea of global Anglo-American control. And it's following through from Rhodes's ideas. CFR then in World War II, very early days of World War II, set up what they would become the Grand Area, they called it. And basically that is the resources around the world were mapped to where they were and how they would take control of those after World War II. It's the coup of coups, really. And that included, obviously, British Empire being nobbled, as it were, and taken over. Any other places around the world, except Russia and parts of Europe, were largely, at that point, left to one side. But the American plan in 1945 was already in place. It had been in place since before Pearl Harbor. The Americans were discussing this 2 weeks after Poland was invaded. They weren't even in the war. And the CFR knocked on the door of the State Department and began their negotiations, and ended up basically taking over the State Department's plans for the future. So, and that was funded by Rockefeller, who funded the purchase of the land for the UN, and so on and so it goes. So all of these internationalist organisations have been the brainchild and the follow-through from Rhodes through Milner onto the Americans. And they obviously then, the Britons were pushed to one side. It's a very special relationship, yeah. We think it's special, they don't. we are useful pawns in the end. So, and today, of course, that CFR concept and the takeover of all these resource areas. So instead of negotiating, you put in place the president who's amenable to your money and to your what you're willing to offer them. And obviously, the CIA executed many presidents over the years and turned them over. And now you might say that was against the Soviet Union and it was the Cold War. So there are you might call them. You've got to look at the balance. But a lot of this was put in place by a famous pair of brothers, the Dulles brothers. Okay, John Foster Dulles was the elder of these two brothers who became significant, and he ended up being head of the State Department of the United States, and his brother, Allen Dulles, became head of the CIA. But you see, from the early 1900s right the way through to the 1940s, they'd been lawyers, international lawyers, setting up all of the contracts with Nazi Germany and into Europe. And in Germany, American, the Ford factories were set up, General Motors set up there with Opel. And so you had all of these international agreements that were drafted by these two brothers, really, largely. So there's a famous American alternative thinker, Buckminster Fuller, and he called it lawyer capitalism. It's not free enterprise system. It's about these packages of laws that you agree. Now, this wasn't all covered in the book in this detail, but I'll be doing it in the next one in more detail, because I think it's significant enough to look at again. But that basically is it. And from the grand area, you needed a military-industrial complex, you see, to project that power. And there was no one really to stand up except the Soviet Union, and we were, just there running along behind, making up the numbers along with everyone else. And this is made plain in my book when I talk about former Dutch Prime Minister saying, when you had the Foster, the Dulles brothers working with Jean Monnet, who set up the European Union, he had huge weight behind him because they knew he's coming in there with the authority from the Dulles brothers. And that's why the EU was established. It's just it's a plaything really of the CFR type thinking.
Just expand on that a little bit. I'm thinking about kind of current day situations nationally and internationally.
Yeah.
Particularly, the situation in Ukraine and Israel.
Right.
How do these ideas come into that?
Well, after the Soviet Union collapsed, then the Americans, were looking to get hands on, obviously, the Russian assets too. And you had Yeltsin, and you had all of these huge resources in Russia. It's not a manufacturing base, but it's a massive resource base. Massive, what you can get out of the ground there. So the Americans were hoping, obviously, to buy up a lot of these and then control those resources. But after Yeltsin, Putin takes over, and he then, of course, with his oligarchs, keeps control then. So it's not coming out to the Americans and these huge finance houses, because there's about 30 corporations run the planet really in terms of most of the assets. Over half of the world's major corporations run by 30. And so, well, you just look at those groups now, these BlackRock and these others. There's a few of them, State Street, I think it is, and Vanguard. And these are the three major ones. It's trillions and trillions of dollars are held by these groups. So they have massive influence, and the ESG is used to leverage that. Okay, and so ESG and the Russian assets are attractive. So hence the Ukrainian idea is obviously to put pressure on the Russians. And as they've said themselves, prime ministers have said this, across Europe, and defense ministers and others about it's a regime change is what they're after in Russia. So if Putin goes, they'd hope to have their man in there, and then they'd be able to start buying up all of these resources. And of course the oligarchs got them cheap, because straight after the Soviet Union. But, once they've got, that is the plan for Ukraine, in my opinion. The ultimate aim was using Ukraine as the proxy to get access to the regime change in Russia to take control. So that's my thinking. It follows from this theme of the global picture, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as I say, the Pentagon makes clear in its strategy that its aim is to get access to all of these goods and materials around the world that they believe are vital to their economy. Well, everything's vital to your economy when you've got such a large economy as the United States. And obviously they make money out of getting access to the resources, because then the profit margin is larger, because it goes from the resource right the way through to the finished product. So you're taking your slice all the way. And when you control the planet with 30 finance groups, as it were, almost all, they're all, some of them are national, but most of them are commercial, then you've got this issue. So if you go into looking at any international event, start thinking globalization. Every event, how does this affect globalization? Would the aim that you see, if you put that aim in your mind, that it's globalization, then you'll come up with some reasonable answer towards it. It's not conspiracy theory. They've laid this out quite clearly. They have to have access. The Pentagon have said this. So then you start thinking globalization and monopolization, hence the reduction in the number of these finance houses into very small numbers. So, and they're too big to break up.
I just want to come back to something you said earlier about ESG, which is such an insidious force, it seems to me, in business. Just Tell us a little bit about that and what's happening with that.
Well, it's largely pushed, by BlackRock and all of the others as well. But BlackRock's the public face of it, you might say. And the issue there you've got is that they talk about, this openly now, that they want to control you and force you into accepting these standards that they believe you should be following, environmental, etc., governance and all these other things. And the aim is to make you conform to what a few finance houses believe you should be conforming to. And it's not about individual liberty. Those things can go out the window. So to my mind, it's pure coercion. This is coercive techniques, and the aim is obviously to make it, we control the finance. So if you want to get any money, you can't get a loan unless you're following these ESG guidelines.
Standards.
But some of the great environmental groups are the biggest oil companies on the planet. So they talk about greenhouse gases on one hand, and then they're saying, oh yeah, but these, Mobil, ExxonMobil is one of the top scoring ESG groups. Yeah. Well, how does that compute? Yeah. So it's indicative, it's a power grab, it's a means of controlling, assets, it's a means of ruining competitors, because if the large groups can put out of control those, because you haven't got them because they can't meet these ESG requirements. Yeah. So they just get bought up cheaper. For instance, this is one method. Yeah. So in the end, I've run a lot of businesses. I've run, successful businesses. So I know when I'm looking, how do I take on a competitor? And I had to fight them on competitive basis. Yeah. I couldn't crush them financially by just getting the banks and these other people to write these rules that would crush them. So my competitors would disappear. Yeah. So you've got Exxon, as I say, one of the largest companies in the world, all oil and gas based, basically, which, the environmental groups would tell you, and it's environmental, it's supposed to be these ESG standards, but they'll rate them highly. And I'll bet you all of the large, oil companies are very high scoring on their charts and get looked after, in terms of finances from these bankers.
It's indicative, really. You talked about the ESG there. If you don't buy into it as a company, then you're gonna go under.
Yeah.
If you don't play along, and that's kind of reflected in society generally. If you don't play along,
exactly,
you're going under.
You're going under.
You lose your career.
The comedy world, we all know about it. You see people cancelled left, right, and centre. Yeah. That is, what's funny in comedy now? Yeah. You've got to go onto these channels where they don't have those controls on it.
Yeah, Comedy Unleashed. We were talking about Leo Curson.
Exactly.
Excellent.
There are excellent comedians out there doing their job.
Yeah.
But the others are having to toe the line. Yeah. And there's good money in comedy now. There's good money in these lines that they want to crush dissent in.
Yeah.
Okay. But you've got Hollywood, Star Wars franchises, and all the rest of it. Completely destroyed by this system, and it's deliberate. It is deliberate because they are pushing, these ideas obviously came from Marxist elements and the undermining of the system. Because, while you had the kind of, you might call it the capitalist nexus, the road side, opposing them, of course, was the communist nexus. Yeah. So, Hollywood is being infiltrated in the 20s, and, you had strikes and all the rest of it going on with the communist groups there then. Ronald Reagan, as I mentioned in my book, had to hide a pistol in his house, and he was sitting up at night sometimes with a pistol guarding his family because of the threats that were coming in. So this is not new, what we see, as you might say, today. It's happened before in Hollywood. And someone like Reagan was seen as a right-winger, although he was actually a Democrat. But again, you see, he's being pushed out. He wasn't Democrat enough, for these...
As is happening now.
Yeah, Antifa.
And you talked about there, you talked about Rhodes. It's funny that Rhodes is kind of utopian vision, and then the Marxists on the opposite, they're utopia. It all starts with this kind of utopian vision, doesn't it? And
exactly. And that's where, my book is, I'm trying to say to people, there's a better way. I'm not saying it's utopian way, but, it's tried and tested. Yeah. It's been tweaked over 175 years in Switzerland. So you don't have to adopt their exact system, but you can learn a lot from it, as Dicey did, 130 years ago. So we're a bit behind the curve. But it's largely, again, who owns the press? Who controls the education system? Who puts in what you can be taught in schools? You'll know about that.
Yeah.
So the reality is that, the whole thing is a lot more controlled than people have ever conceived. And that Truman film,
Yeah.
it's
Truman
pretty
Show,
accurate.
yeah.
The Truman Show.
Yeah.
It's tragic. You look at it and think, oh, that's a strange place. But in reality, we have been fed a line for a long time.
Yeah. Equally, obviously, the Matrix films there as well. It's same kind of thing. So what's current with the movement? I know things are moving along well. So kind of what's in the pipeline now?
Right. Well, as I say, we're working with Neil Oliver's group to get the message out more widely, getting the message to to Nigel Farage, for instance. So hopefully, he will support direct democracy, as he did, in fact, in the European Union. He was head of the direct democracy movement within the European Union, and then to hopefully get people, maybe someone like an Andrew Bridgen or other MPs as well, who see the value. And Andrew Bridgen has at least said he sees the value of direct democracy and referendums, and to get these people to become MPs, representing direct democracy or advocating it, at least in Parliament. And getting the idea in the public imagination, getting it read there in Hansard, and getting it out to these news agencies that, in fact, that there is a different way, and it's a better way, and to get the message down to the mass so that they understand they can vote this thing in. Because ultimately, if you've got a Wilberforce type figure in Parliament, standing up and saying, I want the people to have the final say on major and important issues that affect them. Okay. We're not saying that every law should be, voted on by the people. Obviously not. Complete madness and a waste of time. And a utopian might say that. But I'm not a utopian. I was a military guy. I want to make things work. I was a business guy. I want to make things work there. And I want to see that politically we live in a state where the people do eventually, if necessary, take final control over important issues. And so when they're important enough, the people should have the opportunity to gather signatures, as they do in Switzerland. In Switzerland, it's about 50,000 signatures.
And then they can vote
have a national referendum on it. So you get 50,000, it doesn't mean you've won the day. No, you've still got to have a national referendum. So in this country, you could have, say, 400,000, because proportional, to the Swiss, because we're a much larger nation. Then say you had 500,000, 400,000 signatures, then you could get a national referendum. And the Swiss vote about 4 times a year on this, on referendums. It's not that much, but you're in control, and they've got half the national debt that we have. So this is why I believe it's important. It's not just national debt, but you're in control, and you're in control of the education system, which is feeding you a line all these years, you see?
Is the, I know you've talked about the block vote, which I think if people saw and understood, I think they'd all be in favour of it. It's so simple. Is that system, the kind of the digital app, is it used in Switzerland?
No, they don't.
Right.
They use paper.
Right.
But if you go to the other 2 main nations that use direct democracy, Taiwan and Estonia. Estonia is, I think about 30 to 40% of the people there now vote on apps. They vote. So they use an app that, in fact, believe it or not, it exists across the whole of Europe. This thing was developed for Europe, for the European Union. Did you know that? You see?
No, I didn't know that. No,
exactly.
No.
They don't want you to know about this stuff, you see, but the Estonians said, well, we've got this app we can use. It's developed by the European Union, and we discovered this a couple of years back. Excellent support from someone who found this system, and he went to the developers, and he found out that the British government had stopped its use in Britain and stopped its development by our civil service. Stopped it. Civil service were taking the government to court over it, because they were stopping this direct democracy application being developed here in Britain in line with the European Union. So the European Union has it, and Britain, I think it was under Cameron, stopped it. This is how powerful direct democracy is. They know, these political leaders, not only in Britain but around the world, know that the last thing they want is for their position to be undermined by the people. At last, yeah. Who the hell are they? You see, who
Yeah.
are they? Who are these clowns who think they can tell us to, not listen to the backers? Because who's the property developer, or who are the bankers who are going to, HS2? How much money was spent on that? See, where's that money going? Okay, you've got to borrow huge amounts of money for these projects. So you've got to go to a bank, which then has the license to print, how many, was it 120 billion, whatever it was? That's a lot of interest, in your back pocket. So that you've got to think more deeply than just, to save 30 minutes on your train journey? Come on. They could lose that time anywhere along that route. Half an hour, and the country's going to pay out hundreds of billions, because it'll be hundreds of billions in the end. It starts at 40.
Yeah.
I think the Scottish Parliament started as a £30 million project. It's 400 million by the time they finished.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So the people need control of the purse strings, which is why, in Switzerland, there's a lot more done locally. You take the strings away from the MPs and you do a lot more locally. And the education system is run locally. So the local people decide how they're going to educate their children, not some theoretician, utopian, soft socialist, hard lefty, somewhere in that range probably, is deciding what your education system should be, because they want you to think a certain way, and hence you get woke.
Yeah, I mean, that's so clear now in the education system,
Yeah, because you're not in control.
Tell us about your new book. You mentioned it earlier. You're writing a new book. Can't wait. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I was planning a book before the Gaza conflict, and I was going to call it Ballots Beat Bullets.
Right.
And it was going to be a novel.
Right.
And I was going to just use this theme of an ex-Special Forces regimental sergeant major, highly experienced soldier, who starts to plan for marches using ex-military guys at the forefront to back direct democracy, because he sees the issues that we've got. He's lost his friends, Afghanistan, Iraq, all these other places, and he wakes up to the fact, as the guys who shot bin Laden did, that, why are we doing this? You can watch the guy talk about it. And so I thought, well, let's do this, because I've been on the marches, with the COVID stuff, and I marched for the 100,000 in the NHS, so they would not be pushed out of their jobs, and I'm glad I did, because I think that we've proven how wrong that was. So the aim was to make a novel about this, but then this Gaza thing started, and they had all these marches. I thought, well, it's like I'd be stealing the idea or something, but I'd already planned it out. I'd started putting it together. So I've reverted actually back to non-fiction for this next book, is what I'm thinking.
Right.
That one is history for now. So the aim, I'm thinking about calling it Day of Reckoning.
Okay.
It's about the fact that in the first book, I specifically left out one of the areas that is of real concern, which is Sharia and its application.
Yeah.
And the application that we see that people want to apply it here in Europe, Britain, obviously my main interest. So the original idea with the One Vote Away was money, marks, and the mullahs. So that was the original idea. So I was looking at that, but then to separate it out from direct democracy, I decided that I'd leave it out on that occasion and come back to it later, which is what I'm doing now.
Right.
But what I plan to do is this next book is give a slight update on the money side of things and the mark side before going into more detail on the mullahs side.
Okay.
So there are, because I've not stopped studying really since I finished the book, and in terms of the development that I see on my arguments in the book that you've read, One Vote Away, are to take that deeper and to show even more evidence for what I claim with regards to the system and what we see as, you might call it the 2030 agenda,
Right.
which has become very familiar. And funny enough, when I was running companies in Central Asia, the president of Kazakhstan Nazarbayev, he had this plan for 2030. And same in Azerbaijan, I seem to remember as well. And I thought, where's all this 2030 coming from, of course, you know? And it's all to do with this UN planning. And the UN planning, of course, Rockefeller provides the land and the building. And, of course, the whole theme is spread by them. And the UN is a vehicle, really, for these globalisation, globalist interests. And so that's what it feeds into, and the European Union is just an offshoot of that, really. And there's an excellent book, Prostitutes, okay, in the pay of the CIA by a German journalist, which I actually talk about in the book as well, the original book. But it was indicative of the depth of control by the Americans of the Germans and NATO. Okay, now yes, we say we were under their umbrella for the Cold War, but now, you know,
30 years on.
Yeah. I was an exchange officer with the Americans. I've worked in Washington D.C. You know, so I've seen it from the inside. And, you know, I loved America. I love American people, but I don't like their system anymore. I'm very, very, very wary of America now. Very wary, and you know, we have to be very concerned about our future in our cooperation with them. You know, when you see what's going on now where, you know, Trump is banned from standing as the president, you know, and maybe in some states, though you'll get reciprocal now in Texas against Biden, for instance, or whatever. It's, you know, this is not civil society. No. This is the collapse of civil society. And this is what I'm fighting for, really, to be quite frank with you, because, you know, I was in the military for 16 years. I was in there for a purpose, and I don't want to see it thrown away, you know. And you know, my grandfather was, you know, my father, my brothers. So, you know, so that's what the next book's about. It's trying to help us avoid that by going through the money side, going back to the Marxists and the Antifa, you know, the offshoots, all of these various groups that follow through from that, and then into, you know, the mullahs.
Into the Sharia law.
The Sharia, yeah.
Okay. That'll be interesting. I'll look forward to reading that one.
Yeah.
I'll read that twice as well.
Oh, you read that twice? Yeah,
I'll read that twice.
That's a great recommendation, thank you.
Neil Petrie, it's great to talk to you. I hope we can do it again soon. Good to see you.
Thank you.